welcome to this morning's top story. We want to talk to you a little bit about what Doug Ford has been up to because, of course, he is one of the top stories. Yesterday, he was heckled because he continued in the legislature to insist that he was going to defend his decision to push through a bill slashing Toronto City Council. I'm sure you know the story by now, but just in case you don't, he wants to take City Council and cut it in half in Toronto. He says it's going to expedite projects, and he also says that it is going to save a lot of money. He is using the constitutional provision override the court decision, and he was very, very loudly protested against by, for instance, the NDP party yesterday and this morning as well, to the point where they were booing so loudly that he couldn't speak, and member after member of the NDP party was let out of the chambers. This morning, there were actual protesters in the public gallery, and eventually, with their protests being very vocal as well, as you can imagine, people are upset about this, they became very vocal. They were arrested. They were physically handcuffed and arrested. So we are working on that top story for you. We are staying up to the minute on this story, and we are going to talk to somebody who was one of the protesters that was at the legislature earlier this morning. That's coming up on Top Story. Protesters heckled Ontario Premier Doug Ford in the legislature yesterday as he defended his decision to push through a bill slashing Toronto City Council nearly in half, just days after a judge found that the legislation was unconstitutional. Shouts erupted from the public gallery as Ford argued he was protecting democracy by invoking a constitutional provision to override the court decision, which found his plan to cut the size of the city's council in the middle of an election actually violated candidates' and voters' freedom of expression rights. Asked whether he believed in the Charter of Rights, the Premier said a democratically elected government should not be derailed by a politically appointed judge. The Premier maintains cutting Toronto City Council to 25 seats from 47 is necessary to streamline decision-making and save taxpayer money. And as we told you on Top Story just moments ago, the big story really today, one of them at least, is about Doug Ford and the fact that he went into the legislature yesterday and defended his position to push through a bill slashing Toronto City Council. The court told him that that wasn't legal, that he could not do that. He went in yesterday and said that he absolutely is going to forge through with it. Well, this morning, there were lots of protesters at the legislature, and we are lucky enough to be able to speak to one from Toronto, Michaela Murphy. Michaela, good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm pretty good. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much. Tell me about the protest this morning. Was it really organized, or did you just go by yourself?
It was actually yesterday morning.
Yesterday.
I went by myself. I received an email letting me know that there was going to be an opportunity to pack the galleries to show the Ford government our feelings about what he was trying to do. So I just walked over to Queen's Park and got in line to try and get into the galleries so that I could observe what he was going to be doing.
Now, we ran some video earlier today on the show, on the morning show, and earlier today about people in the gallery and police officers, security people actually coming into the gallery and handcuffing people. Were you one of those people?
No. I was, as I said, there was a long lineup. There were hundreds of people trying to get in. We had to go through security and check cell phones and all that sort of thing. So I was actually next in line to go into the gallery, and suddenly the security people pulled the cross and said we can't go in, and that's when the disruption was happening in the gallery, and then they kicked everybody out.
So at that point,
I didn't get a chance to actually go in.
So at that point, when they told you you couldn't go in, did you know that the disruption had started, or did they give you a reason?
Yeah, they told us that people were making noise in the gallery and the speaker had made an order to clear the gallery. But I didn't know that people were being arrested at that point.
And with regards to the reason behind most people were there, yourself included, of course, why did you show up?
Well, I was there not because of the legislation calling for the Toronto City Council to be cut in half. That wasn't the issue for me anymore. When Doug Ford announced that he was going to use the Notwithstanding Clause in order to push through this legislation, that alarmed me greatly. And I wrote letters, but that didn't feel like enough. And I just felt that I had to be there to show physically by my presence how strongly I felt this idea of using the Notwithstanding Clause.
What concerns you so much about?
Instead of going through the process of an appeal.
Because he did say he was going to go through the appeal. What scares you so much about him using the Notwithstanding Clause?
Well, the Notwithstanding Clause basically overrides our rights that are enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's a mechanism that is there. I'm not saying it's not legal for him to use it, but the idea of that Notwithstanding Clause was intended to be an extraordinary measure that would only be used in specific circumstances. That it has not been used ever in the province of Ontario is an indication of how extraordinary the circumstances should be before that gets used. Basically, what happened was the judge ruled against their legislation. And instead of, of course, sometimes people disagree with what judges say. The whole idea of the judicial system is that there's an appeals process. And Doug Ford chose, rather than, yes, he said he was going to appeal it, but he said that this was an issue of such urgency that more invoked the Notwithstanding Clause. What I fail to understand is, what is it that is so urgent to all Ontarians that this legislation that is specific to the City of Toronto Council has to get pushed through immediately?
Well, I think that's a really good point that you're making, Michaela, because of course it's something of interest to all of us who live in Ontario. But as you said, it's a very specific situation for Toronto proper. And a lot of people are wondering what the big commotion is about. What's the urgency that he feels the need to, in an election campaign for municipal elections, he feels it's absolutely an emergency to get this done.
Right. And the other thing that's really interesting is when the judge made his ruling earlier this week, he actually said that if this legislation had been passed to take place during the next municipal election, that there would not be any kind of contravention of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms or the Constitution. So basically, all Doug Ford and his government had to do was to wait until after this upcoming municipal election, and then introduce the legislation again to make it 4 years from now. There is no urgency other than the urgency that he says exists. And the other thing that I have to say is that I'm really concerned that it seems that the entire Progressive Conservative caucus and cabinet are standing behind him on this, and I find that very disturbing.
Especially
that someone
publicly.
Like Carolyn Maroney, who is the Attorney General and a lawyer, Christine Elliott, who is a cabinet minister and a lawyer, that these people who should understand the rule of law and have a respect for the judicial process and understand that the judicial system is there to check the powers of the legislative branch of government. I can't believe that they are in good conscience supporting this legislation.
And especially because they were his opponents in the election.
Yes, and I know of a number of people who voted Conservative in the last election who said, well, we don't really like Doug Ford, but we we like a conservative government, and we think everybody else will keep him in check. The more moderate members of the government will keep him in check and not let him do ridiculous things. And here we see them standing back while he invokes the Notwithstanding Clause for a trivial matter and lambastes a judge and says that he's a radical activist, that he clearly doesn't understand that democracy involves not just the legislative branch, but also the judicial branch of government.
As a protester...
And I wonder where Ross Romano is on this. I know I live in Toronto, but I own a house in the Soo. I'm planning to move back there within the next couple of years. Ross Romano will be my member of parliament or member of provincial parliament. And I'm concerned that he seems to have also supported this measure. I've sent him a letter, but I haven't heard back from him yet.
We've also requested his presence and haven't heard back yet either, Michaela. Have you heard any word on what's happened to the people who were arrested, the protesters who were arrested?
No, all I know is they were taken out in handcuffs. And actually, the 70-plus-year-old woman,
yes,
was my neighbor. So I know her, and she's just a normal, regular person who cares.
So were these protesters being... obviously, they were being vocal because they were protesting.
Yes.
Were they being belligerent? Were they cursing? Were they being abusive?
I wasn't there. I wasn't
Right.
in the gallery, but from what I heard from people who actually were in the gallery was that they were basically just calling out, I think they were calling Doug Ford a bully, and they were saying this isn't democracy and we are the people and we don't agree. Now, that's against the rules. You're not supposed to do that when you're in the gallery. You're supposed to remain quiet. And most of the time, people do that. I know that there are people who will say, well, they were breaking the rules, so they deserve to be. In a case like this, where the government is taking such extraordinary measures to trample our rights, to override the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, what else are we supposed to do? If I had been in that gallery, I can tell you I would have been standing right there with the woman who was arrested.
Do you feel at this point...
Because it was completely wrong. What they're doing is completely wrong.
Do you feel at this point, as an Ontarian, as a voter, as a protester, that you were heard this morning or yesterday morning?
Oh, I don't think the Ford government heard anything. They have no respect for anybody who opposes or speaks against them. Doug Ford has made it clear that what he's doing is following the wishes of the 2.3 million people who voted for him. He keeps repeating that he was elected because 2.3 million people voted for him. Those are the only people he cares about. He has no understanding of the idea that as the premier of the province, he is supposed to be making decisions in the best interest of everyone.
And to be an example as to how...
the majority rules, maybe, yes, that's true. But we also live in a democracy in which the rights of the minority must be considered. And they're not doing that in this case.
Just before we let you go, Michaela, do you have any sense of the appeal and what's going to happen with that going forward? In my mind, appeals take months.
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but that's my experience too. I mean, democracy takes time.
It does.
And sometimes you have to wait to get what you want. If it goes through the appeal system and the judge's ruling is overturned, that means that it would be okay for the Ford government to reintroduce their legislation. And while I might not like it, I would be fine with that because they had followed the process and got the ruling and made their argument. They make their arguments and you go with whatever. That's democracy.
Well, you wonder if they're taking such dramatic steps on an issue that is certainly not disastrous or in any way an emergency level situation. What else are they going to use that for?
Yeah, that's the scary part. And Doug Ford said, I won't be shy about, he calls it a tool in his toolbox. You know, he just doesn't understand. This is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This is the Constitution. It isn't a tool.
Michaela, thank you so much for taking time, and let us know if there are any further developments.
Oh, I will. I'll keep you posted.
Thank you, Michaela. Thanks so much. Michaela Murphy, in Toronto, protester yesterday morning against the provincial PC party, and specifically Doug Ford. We have more Top Story right after this.